high desert winds of eastern California whisper secrets that the living are not meant to hear. Located east of the Sierra Nevada mountain range, the abandoned streets of Bodie stand frozen in a state of arrested decay. This is not merely a collection of rotting wood and rusted metal, but a monument to the avarice and desperation that defined the American West. The silence here is heavy and oppressive, broken only by the creaking of tin roofs and the howling gusts that seem to carry the voices of the damned. Visitors who walk these dusty paths often report a sensation of being watched from the empty windows of the structures that remain. It is a place where history refuses to die, and the spirits of the past cling jealously to their claim. Before the saloons and the stamp mills shattered the silence, this land was a harsh and unforgiving wilderness known only to the indigenous people and the most hardened explorers. The altitude is high, sitting at over 8,000 feet, where the air is thin and the winters are brutal. In the year 1859, a group of prospectors, including William Bodie, discovered gold in these desolate hills. It was a discovery that would spark one of the wildest mining booms in the history of the United States. However, tragedy struck almost immediately as William Bodie perished in a blizzard while attempting to fetch supplies. His frozen body was not found until the following spring, a grim omen for the town that would eventually bear his name, albeit with a changed spelling. The transformation from a lonely mining claim to a bustling metropolis was fueled by the discovery of a massive vein of gold ore in the mid-1870s. The Standard Consolidated Mining Company was formed, and suddenly money began to flow like water through the high desert. Miners, gamblers, prostitutes, and gunslingers flocked to the remote location, driven by the promise of instant wealth. Within a few years, the population swelled to nearly 10,000 souls. The town boasted 2 banks, a volunteer fire department, a brass band, railroad, unions, and several daily newspapers. But alongside these trappings of civilization, there were 65 saloons lining Main Street, each one a potential powder keg of violence and vice. Bodie quickly earned a reputation as one of the most lawless and dangerous towns in the entire American West. It was said that a morning in Bodie was not complete without asking who had been killed the night before. The phrase "a man for breakfast" became a common expression to describe the daily occurrences of murder and mayhem. Fistfights, shootings, and stagecoach robberies were regular events. The isolation of the town meant that the law was often enforced by the barrel of a gun rather than a judge in a courtroom. In this cauldron of greed and alcohol, life was cheap, and death was a constant companion walking the boardwalks alongside the living. A famous story from the era captures the terrifying reputation of the town perfectly. It involves a young girl whose family was preparing to move to the notorious mining camp. She reportedly knelt by her bed to pray and ended her prayer by saying, "Goodbye, God. I am going to Bodie." The local editors claimed she had been misquoted and had actually said, "Good by God. I am going to Bodie." Regardless of the punctuation, the sentiment remained clear. To go to Bodie was to leave behind the safety of civilized society and enter a world where morality was flexible and survival was never guaranteed. The town was a place where angels feared to tread, but demons found a welcoming home. The harsh environment itself seemed to conspire against the inhabitants. The winters in Bodie are legendary for their ferocity, with temperatures dropping well below zero and snow drifts burying single-story buildings. During the Great Winter of 1878 to 1879, many residents died from exposure and disease. The ground would freeze so solid that graves could not be dug, and bodies had to be stored in snowbanks until the spring thaw. This proximity to death created a psychological weight that pressed down on the town. The howling wind was often interpreted as the crying of lost souls wandering the frozen wasteland, unable to find warmth or rest. Among the thousands who came seeking fortune was a man named Thomas Vance. He was a Cornish miner who had traveled across the ocean and the continent, chasing the rumors of the rich strikes in the California hills. Thomas was a quiet man, serious and hardworking, unlike the rowdy crowds that filled the saloons each night. He found work at the Standard Mill, where the deafening roar of the stamps crushing quartz rock continued 24 hours a day, 6 days a week. The noise was so loud it could be heard miles away, a constant mechanical heartbeat that drove some men to madness. For Thomas, the mill was not just a workplace, but a cavernous dungeon of dust and shadows. Thomas secured lodging in a small boarding house near the center of town, not far from the Dechambeau Hotel. It was a drafty building with thin walls that did little to block out the sounds of the street or the biting cold. On his first night, he lay awake listening to the muffled shouts of drunkards and the distant piano music from the gambling halls. But as the town quieted in the pre-dawn hours, he heard something else. It was the sound of heavy boots walking slowly down the hallway outside his door. The footsteps were rhythmic and deliberate, stopping just in front of his room before fading into silence. When he opened the door to check, the hallway was empty. He dismissed the incident as the product of an overactive imagination and the stress of travel. However, the feeling of unease persisted as he settled into his daily routine. The mine shafts were claustrophobic and dark, lit only by the flickering flame of candles and lanterns. Deep underground, the air was thick and stale. Thomas began to notice that the other miners were superstitious, often carrying charms or refusing to work in certain tunnels where accidents had occurred. They spoke in hushed tones about the Tommyknockers, mischievous spirits of the mines that would knock on the walls to warn of impending cave-ins or to lure men to their doom. One evening, after a grueling 12-hour shift, Thomas decided to visit the Miners' Union Hall to attend a meeting. The streets were slick with mud and melting snow. As he passed the undertaking parlor, he saw a figure standing in the shadows of the porch. It appeared to be a woman dressed in a long black morning gown, her face obscured by a veil. He nodded a greeting, but the figure did not respond. A sudden gust of wind whipped up dust around him, stinging his eyes. When he looked back, the woman was gone. There was nowhere she could have vanished to so quickly, and a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air ran down his spine. The violence in Bodie escalated as the gold veins grew richer. The opium dens in the Chinatown district became dens of despair, where men sought to escape the harsh reality of their lives. Thomas tried to stay away from the trouble, but trouble seemed to permeate the very air. He witnessed a gunfight outside the Methodist church one Sunday morning, where two men drew revolvers over a dispute involving a card game. The loser lay bleeding in the dirt, his life draining away, while the church bells rang for the service. The juxtaposition of the holy and the profane was a stark reminder of the battle for souls happening in this high desert purgatory. The supernatural encounters began to increase in frequency and intensity. Thomas started seeing shadows moving in the periphery of his vision while working in the Standard Mill. These were not mere tricks of the light, but distinct human shapes that seemed to observe the workers with malevolent intent. One night, while maintaining the machinery, he felt a cold hand grip his shoulder. He spun around, expecting to see the foreman, but there was no one there. The temperature in that section of the mill dropped drastically, and his breath puffed out in white clouds despite the heat generated by the steam engines. Rumors began to circulate about a curse on the town. People whispered that the gold they were extracting was tainted, that the earth itself was angry at being torn apart. Accidents in the mines became more frequent. Men fell down shafts, were crushed by falling rock, or were blown apart by premature dynamite explosions. The cemetery on the hill, known as Boot Hill, grew rapidly. It was said that the dead outnumbered the living, and their restless spirits were beginning to reclaim the town. Thomas found himself spending more time at the cemetery, drawn to the quiet solitude of the grave markers. The focal point of the haunting seemed to be the J.S. Kane House, located on the corner of Green and Park Streets. James Stuart Kane was a prominent figure in Bodie, eventually owning the bank and much of the town. It was rumored that his house was a center of spiritual activity. Thomas heard stories from the Kane family servants about doors opening and closing on their own, and the sound of children laughing in empty rooms. The ghost of a Chinese maid was said to wander the halls. Unable to find peace after being dismissed under tragic circumstances, the house stood as a dark sentinel, watching over the decay of the town. One particular night in late October, a heavy storm rolled over the Sierra Nevada, blanketing Bodie in a thick layer of snow. The wind howled with a ferocity that shook the buildings to their foundations. Thomas was alone in his room, reading a letter from home by the light of a kerosene lamp. Suddenly, the flame flickered and died, plunging the room into darkness. He fumbled for a match, but before he could strike it, he heard a voice whisper his name directly into his ear. The voice was raspy and dry, like dead leaves dragging across stone. It whispered, "Thomas, leave this place." Terrified, Thomas struck the match. The flare of light revealing nothing but the peeling wallpaper of his room. He sat up all night, shivering in the cold, clutching a Bible he barely read. The next day, he went to work exhausted and on edge. The mind felt more oppressive than ever. As he descended in the cage, the darkness seemed to press against him physically. He saw the flicker of a lantern deep in an abandoned drift, a tunnel that had been closed off years ago due to instability. The light bobbed and weaved, moving deeper into the earth, beckoning him to follow. Against his better judgment, Thomas felt a compulsion to investigate. He left his station and walked toward the boarded-up tunnel. The wood planks were rotten and easily pulled aside. The air inside was stagnant and smelled of sulfur. As he walked deeper, the lantern light ahead of him vanished. He stopped, holding his own light high. In the shadows, he saw the outline of a man wearing the tattered rags of a miner from the early days of the rush. The figure turned slowly, revealing a face that was skeletal and devoid of eyes. Thomas screamed and scrambled back, his boots slipping on the wet rock. He emerged from the tunnel gasping for breath, his heart hammering against his ribs. He told no one of what he had seen, fearing he would be labeled insane and fired. But the image of the skeletal miner haunted his dreams. He began to drink heavily to suppress the memories. Joining the ranks of the men he had once looked down upon, the saloon became his refuge, the whiskey burning away the fear for a few hours at a time. But even in the crowded barrooms, he could feel eyes watching him from the dark corners. The climax of the horror arrived with the Great Fire of 1892. It started in a restaurant on Main Street and spread rapidly, fueled by the strong winds and the dry timber of the buildings. Chaos erupted as residents scrambled to save their possessions. Thomas was in the street when the alarm was raised. The sky turned a blood red as the flames licked the night. Amidst the panic, Thomas saw something that froze his blood. Standing in the middle of the inferno, untouched by the fire, were the shadowy figures he had seen in the mill and the mine. They seemed to be feeding on the destruction, their forms growing larger and more distinct. The fire consumed a large portion of the business district, destroying banks saloons, and homes. It was a blow from which Bodie would never fully recover. As the buildings collapsed, Thomas saw the figure of the woman in black walking calmly through the burning debris. She stopped and looked directly at him, lifting her veil to reveal a face that was a mirror of his own, twisted in agony. It was a vision of his own potential fate, a warning that if he stayed, he would become just another ghost in a town of ghosts. Following the fire of 1892, the decline of Bodie accelerated. The gold began to run out, and the large mining companies started to scale back operations. People left in droves, seeking new opportunities in other boomtowns. Houses were abandoned with furniture still inside, tables set for meals that would never be eaten. The town began to die a slow, agonizing death. Thomas, shaken by his visions, finally decided to heed the warning. He packed his meager belongings and prepared to catch the stagecoach out of town. But the town does not let go of its own easily. On his final night, a heavy fog descended on Bodie, obscuring the moon and stars. Thomas walked to the cemetery to pay his respects to a friend who had died in a mining accident. The iron gates of the cemetery creaked open. As he stood by the grave, the fog swirled around him, forming shapes that looked like grasping hands. He heard the sound of digging, the rhythmic thud of a shovel hitting earth. He followed the sound to an open grave at the edge of the yard. Looking down into the pit, he saw a coffin with his own name etched onto the lid. The shock caused him to stumble back, tripping over a headstone. He fell hard, hitting his head. As darkness took him, he heard the laughter of children and the tolling of the church bell. When he awoke, it was morning. The sun was shining brightly, burning off the fog. He was lying on the frozen ground of the cemetery, alone. The open grave was gone, replaced by undisturbed earth. He scrambled to his feet and ran all the way to the stagecoach stop, never looking back. Thomas escaped Bodie with his life, but a part of him remained trapped in the high desert. He spent the rest of his days looking over his shoulder, jumping at shadows. He wrote down his experiences in a journal that was found years later, a testament to the darkness that resided in the gold camp. Bodie continued to wither. A second massive fire in 1932 destroyed much of what remained, leaving only about 10% of the original town standing. The population dwindled until only a handful of caretakers were left. By the mid-20th century, Bodie had become a true ghost town. It was designated a National Historic Landmark and a State Historic Park in 1962. The state of California adopted a policy of arrested decay, meaning the buildings would be preserved as they were found, not restored to their former glory. They would simply be prevented from falling down. This policy has preserved the eerie atmosphere of the town. Visitors today can peer through the windows and see stocked shelves in the general store, dusty bottles in the saloon, and school books left on desks. However, the spirits of Bodie have not remained silent. Park rangers and tourists frequently report unexplainable phenomena. There are accounts of the smell of garlic cooking in the Mendocini house, even though no one has lived there for decades. The heavy scent of cigar smoke often lingers in the old saloon. The sounds of a party, complete with piano music and laughter, have been heard coming from empty buildings late at night. The entity known as the Angel of Bodie is sometimes seen watching over the town from the hills. A benevolent spirit in a place of darkness. More menacing is the curse associated with taking artifacts from the park. The rangers receive letters every month from people who stole a nail, a piece of glass, or a rock from Bodie as a souvenir. These letters are filled with tales of bad luck, illness, financial ruin, and accidents that befell the thieves shortly after they took the items. They return the artifacts with desperate apologies, begging for the curse to be lifted. This phenomenon is so common that the park has a collection of these returned items and the letters that accompanied them. One letter detailed a car accident that happened immediately after leaving the park with a rusty spike. Another described a sudden mysterious illness that struck a family member after a piece of ceramic was taken. The curse of Bodie is widely respected, serving as a supernatural security system for the historic site. It suggests that the residents of the town, even in death, are fiercely protective of their property. They do not welcome thieves, and their vengeance is swift and unrelenting. Photographers who visit the town often capture strange anomalies in their images. Orbs of light, shadowy figures standing in windows, and inexplicable mists are common. Some have reported their camera equipment malfunctioning for no reason, batteries draining instantly, or shutters refusing to fire. A visiting psychic once claimed that the energy in the cemetery is overwhelming. A cacophony of voices crying out to be heard. The spirits of the miners, the gunfighters, and the children who died too young are still present, bound to the bleak landscape. The Dechambeau Hotel remains a hotspot for activity. Visitors have reported seeing a woman peering out from the second-story window. When rangers investigate, the building is locked and empty. There are stories of a little girl who haunts the cemetery, giggling and playing hide and seek among the tombstones. She is often seen near the grave of the Angel of Bodie, a statue of an angel that marks the resting place of a child. It is a poignant reminder of the innocence that was lost in this harsh environment. The Standard Mill, now silent, is perhaps the most imposing structure left. Tour of the mill are conducted, but guides often feel uneasy in certain areas. The sensation of being pushed or touched is reported by tourists. It is as if the ghostly workers are still trying to meet their quotas, resentful of the living who intrude on their eternal shift. The dust that coats everything in the mill is said to contain the sweat and blood of the men who labored there. Nighttime in Bodie is strictly forbidden to the general public, and for good reason. When the sun sets behind the mountains, the temperature plummets and the shadows lengthen. This is when the town truly belongs to the dead. The park rangers who live on site tell stories of hearing heavy footsteps on their porches, of doors unlocking themselves, and of lights turning on in buildings that have no electricity. They learn to live with these invisible neighbors, respecting the boundaries between the past and the present. One ranger described an encounter in the Wheaton and Holly's Hotel. He was doing a routine check when he heard the distinct sound of a heavy object being dragged across the floor upstairs. He called out, identifying himself, but there was no answer. As he climbed the stairs, the temperature dropped, and he felt a wave of intense sadness. He found nothing upstairs, but the dust on the floor was disturbed, as if something large had been moved recently. He left the building and locked it, never returning alone at night. The legend of the Chinese residence is also prominent. The Chinatown section of Bodie was located on a ridge and has mostly disappeared, but the spiritual imprint remains. It was a place of opium dens and distinct cultural practices. Visitors to that area of the park often report feeling a sudden sense of disorientation or dizziness. Some claim to hear the faint sound of traditional Chinese music drifting on the wind. It is a reminder of the segregation and hardship faced by the Chinese community during the Gold Rush era. Today, Bodie stands as a time capsule, a physical representation of the phrase boom and bust. It is a place where the American dream collided with the harsh reality of the frontier. The preserved buildings are shells, but they are filled with the energy of the thousands of people who lived, loved, fought, and died there. The dry desert air preserves not just the wood, but the memories and the emotions of the past. It is a place that demands respect, a place where the veil between worlds is dangerously thin. The curse of the stolen items serves as a final, lingering warning. It tells us that nothing in Bodie is truly abandoned. Every nail, every shard of glass, and every stone belongs to the spirits that still inhabit the town. To take from Bodie is to invite the darkness into your own life. The town may be empty of living residents, but it is far from deserted. The eyes that watch from the windows are not empty, they are waiting. As you drive away from the park, leaving the dirt road and returning to the pavement of the modern world, the feeling of unease often persists. You may check your backseat, ensuring that nothing has followed you home. But for those who have walked the streets of Bodie, the memory of the silence and the wind remains etched in their minds. The town is a ghost story written in wood and stone, a preserved nightmare of the gold rush that refuses to be forgotten. The story of Thomas Vance may be lost to history, a composite of the many men who suffered in the mines, but the reality of the fear is palpable. Whether you believe in ghosts or not, Bodhi challenges your skepticism. It forces you to confront the possibility that some places absorb the energy of the events that occurred there. The tragedy, the violence, and the greed have stained the land, creating a permanent scar on the high desert landscape. The sun sets on Bodhi, casting long shadows that stretch across the valley floor. The wind picks up, whistling through the gaps in the siding of the Methodist church. The cemetery gates rattle on their hinges. In the darkness, the town comes alive in its own way. The saloon doors swing open. The stamps in the mill begin their phantom rhythm, and the streets fill with the spectral forms of the past. They are the permanent residents of Bodhi, and they are always watching. So if you ever find yourself on the lonely road to Bodhi, remember the warnings. Walk softly, speak in hushed tones, and take nothing but photographs. Leave the past where it lies, buried in the dust and the snow. For in Bodhi, the past is never truly dead, and the ghosts of the gold rush are waiting for the next soul to join their eternal vigil.